South Korea was very successful for the reasons that Ramon talked about in terms of democracy and then economic development. And North Korea, in its own way, was very successful too in consolidating the state, the leadership, nuclear weapons in their own way. But both of them had failures too.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, Korean Fallout, Impeachment, Nuclear Tests, and K-pop, with Dr. Victor Cha and Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo. We will look at the current state of Korea, which many may describe as chaotic, both north and south of the 38th parallel, also known as the DMZ. We will explore the peninsula's history, and we will look ahead to what may be coming down the line for the people of Korea. My name is Daphna Tsuer, and I am Associate Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Stanford University. I am a scholar of Korean literature, and as many of you may know, South Korea recently celebrated its first Nobel Prize in Literature with the writer Han Gang. But I also do research on South Korean literature and popular culture, as well as on North Korean literature and culture. So it is my distinct honor to facilitate this conversation today. Before we begin, a quick reminder to please silence your phones to avoid any disruptions. We also welcome your questions and will incorporate as many as we can. So for those of you with us in the room today, please submit questions through the cards provided on your seats. If you are joining us online, please type them into the live chat. I am joined by two esteemed guests. Dr. Victor Cha, my left, is President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as Distinguished University Professor at Georgetown University. Alongside him is Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Together, they authored this book, Korea, A New History of South and North, a groundbreaking book that offers fresh insights into one of the world's most dynamic and complex regions. In fact, it is such a dynamic region that, given the events taking place on the peninsula in just the last few weeks and months, the book may already demand an updated edition. So welcome to our audience member. Thank you so much for coming today. I'll say one last thing. Both Victor and Ramon have extensive resumes. Victor served both the Bush Jr. and Biden administrations. He was on the National Security Council between 2004 and 2007, responsible for Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island nations. And from 2021 to 2025, he was appointed to the Defense Policy Board in an advisory role to the Secretary of Defense. Ramon has participated in Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues with China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. He has also helped shape and implement King's College London's strategy for East and Southeast Asia as the university's regional envoy. So I'd like to start by asking the two of you to tell us a little bit about the origins of this book. Why did you feel that we needed a book like this, and how did you come to work on it together?
Well, first, Daphna, thanks so much for being here to moderate this conversation with Ramon and myself, and thank you also to Philip Yun for the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Council for hosting us today. So I think when we started thinking about doing this, there was a book that we had in mind that both of us had read. I'm sure you've read it too. It's offered in many courses on Korea, and it was a book by the Washington Post reporter Don Oberdorfer. The book was called The Two Koreas. Fantastic book, beautifully written, just a wonderful history of Korea. But the book was written about 25 years ago, I think. And, again, it's a fantastic history, but there's nothing about North Korea's nuclear weapons. There's nothing about BTS. There's nothing about Blackpink. There's lots of things that are not in the book just because it was written so long ago. So in writing this book, we wanted to write a history of the two Koreas that would sort of be sort of the sequel or the next book after the two Koreas. And we thought what would make it interesting would be if an American and a European were to write it together, because I think we think about and study Korea in different ways. And I thought that was, for me personally, that was really interesting. But the result was a book that goes from the late, as you know, from the late 19th century, starting with the Kanghua Treaty, the Treaty of Kanghua in 1876, and it goes all the way up to
Last year, really.
yeah, last year, yeah, before the re-election of Donald Trump, but it goes up to 2024. So that's why we wrote it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I come from Spain myself, and it's true that the approach that we have in Europe towards Korea is very different. We focus less on the history, I would say, because we don't have a history of strong relations with Korea, and we focus more on the culture, obviously, which is extremely popular in Europe, but also the comparison, right? Because Korea, similarly to my own country, Spain, used to be a very poor country, dictatorial regime in the case of South Korea, and then transition to a democracy. So there were these parallels that you see in many different European countries. So for example, in a couple of months we'll be in Poland, where they actually have Korea as the guest country for the international book fair that they have there. And Central Eastern European countries also feel this affinity with South Korea, right? Because they have also transitioned to democracy, but also with North Korea, because they used to be communist regimes. So our approach to studying Korea and explaining Korea is different, certainly, from the US one.
Can you share a little bit more about working together? I mean, it's a very different experience than writing a monograph on your own, obviously. So, so how did you work together, and particularly sort of the you spoke a little bit just now about sort of your perspective as a European, but how did that come out, or did it come out in your work together? Were there really different perspectives that you needed to reconcile?
Yes, so yes, we had to reconcile different perspectives, but it worked out very well, I have to say. I mean, it was very easy to co-author the book. I think we drafted different chapters, first drafted different chapters, each of us, then we exchanged it multiple times. So it was really a very collaborative process. And it's interesting you asked this, because over the weekend we were in DC for an event, and someone approached me and said, "Tell me, Ramon, you wrote the book, right?" And Victor just put his name on it. It's like, no, why would you think that? He was a senior Korean professor who thought I was doing all the work for him. But no, it was really 50-50, really. I mean, we work on it for hands, and say we're exchanging the chapters, and then what we did as well, complement each other, because obviously on my side, there are certain aspects of Korean history that I would know because I have studied them, but Victor would have deeper knowledge than I do, and certainly obviously the relationship between the two Koreas, or Korea as a unified country, and the U.S. The U.S. I don't have that perspective.
So I agree. We did write about, each of us wrote about half the book. Contrary to what people think, I actually wrote the late 19th century chapter, and then through the Korean War, and then I wrote the chapters on unification. And Ramon really wrote the stuff in the middle, from the 1960s to the 2000s. For me, it was, I really welcomed the opportunity. I've only co-authored one other book before with David Kong at USC, and so this was a somewhat new experience for me. And I was really excited about co-authoring with Ramon. Probably many of you don't know, but Ramon Pacheco Pardo is the European Union Korea chair. There's only one Korea chair in all of Europe, and Ramon holds that chair. And I think of all the scholars in Europe that are working on Korea, he's really sort of the top scholar And I would say rising star because you're like half my age, I think maybe. But still a rising star, even though you're very much accomplished and a professor at King's College. So it was a very nice experience to work with him. I think particularly what I noticed when we were drafting the chapters is I became much more conscious of how I, as an American, study Korea compared to the way Europeans study Korea. And what became very clear to me when we were writing the chapters is that I have a very America-centric view of studying Korea, which is really about the origins of the alliance, the creation of the alliance, the U.S. occupation. So I remember in particular when we were writing about the immediate post-World War II, pre-Korean War period, that period from 1945 to 1950, I was supposed to write that chapter. So I did a first cut of it, and I wrote about General John Hodge, and I wrote about the establishment of UNCTAD. I wrote about the armistice and violations of the armistice, things like this. And I sent the chapter to Ramon, and he's exquisitely polite, but he writes me back and he goes, perhaps I think maybe we should include something about Korean society. Because when I look back, all I wrote about was the U.S. occupation, and because I look at it largely from an alliance perspective, and he was absolutely right. I mean, we have to write about what Korean society was like after the sudden end of the Japanese occupation, which Koreans at that time never thought that the occupation would ever end, and so I think that was really useful to me, and I gained a lot from that. But it really was fun to write because throughout the book, I could see our different perspectives. Again, mine was very much of a political science, IR, national security, alliance perspective. And I would say, and it's not meant in any judgmental way, I think a European study of Korea is much more about Korean studies. It's a much deeper appreciation of Korean society, politics, and history versus sort of an American political science view.
So for the benefit of those who haven't had a chance to read the book, I want to ask you kind of a tough question, and not challenging, but to give us a bit of a sense of the narrative arc of this book. So what is the story that you're telling about North and South Korea? So kind of for those who haven't had a chance to read it. But I also want to ask you, when one writes kind of a grand narrative like this, I mean, it's a very nice and compact book, meaning short-ish for a big, history of Korea. Obviously, there's a lot that you can't write, that you can't keep in. So maybe to ask you, what do you think is, if you can critique the book a little bit, what do you think is lost? What is sort of about the granular history that may have been lost just because of the constraints of writing a kind of a narrative, a beautifully written book like this? So what do you think you lost, and what episodes do you wish that you could have kept in the book that you weren't able to because of constraints of space? So if you could give us first a kind of a broad recap of the narrative of the book.
I think the book is really about how much Korea and the Koreas have changed. Not only intrinsically, but also from the perspective of others. So we start in the 19th century, so right before Korea was colonized. So it was really a minor power at the mercy of the big powers of the day. And today is completely different type of countries, right? But if we focus on the South, Victor mentioned BTS or Blackpink, but in the UK, 15 years ago, when I started teaching my class about East Asia, people were interested in China and doing business with China. Those were the students that came to my classes. And these days, two-thirds of them are interested in Korea, right? So the change in how Korea is being perceived, even in Europe, where we don't have the history that you have here in the US of deeper relations with the country, even the people-to-people links in Europe, they came later, right, compared to the US or to other countries. So that's why we try to explain in the book why the country has changed and has reached a stage where it is today. Only in the case of North Korea, we focus more on the military aspect, nuclear weapons. But in the case of the South, we take this holistic approach. We talk about the economic development, societal transformation, democratization of the country, and really how the countries look at Korea, South Korea as a model, for example, of economic development. Even in Europe, now that we're talking about technology, right? Many European countries realize that we are far behind Korea when it comes to new technologies. So we try to show that in the book. So that's one of the grand narratives that we have in the book.
Yeah, I think we start out the book again from the late 19th century and use the example of the Treaty of Kanghua and then the wars between China and Japan, Russia and Japan, the deals cut by the United States with Japan with regard to Korea and the Philippines, really to set up the first narrative, which is that Korea is a country whose geography never changes. It lives in a tough neighborhood. It's relatively smaller compared to the other big powers, and for that reason, its fate is often tied to geopolitical struggles in the region, especially when it's internally weak. When it's internally weak, at the end of the Joseon dynasty, it was weak, it was corrupt, and so that when Korea was very much at the mercy of sort of geopolitics and geopolitical competition. But then as we tell the story of South Korea and North Korea, in many ways, both of them were very successful in their projects. I mean, South Korea was very successful for the reasons that Ramon talked about in terms of democracy and then economic development. And North Korea, in its own way, was very successful too in consolidating the state, the leadership, nuclear weapons in their own way. But both of them had failures too, right? And we talk about the stresses in modern Korean society today, obviously the failures in North Korea. The other thing that we do, which I think is, and Ramon did the brunt of this work, was when we started talking about the 20th century, where so much happened after the Korean War. We wrote the chapters were written as telling the story of the two Koreas in each chapter, so you could see how each one developed and how where they failed, how they developed. It's almost telling their story side by side, as opposed to doing different chapters. In terms of what we were not able to include, of course, there's a lot we were not able to include, but I would say that, like when I go back and read the book, or I'm sure when you read the book or others, we touch on a lot of things, but we don't go into depth on a lot of things. So we touch on a lot of things. We talk about the role of we talk about the role of women in democratization, LGBTQ plus movement in Korea, but we're not afforded the luxury of being able to go into any of those topics in depth. So I think for somebody who's never studied or learned about Korea or only know about one part of Korea, like K-pop or K-drama or something, it's a good book to sort of understand about Korea. But if you're a scholar reading it, you're probably like, oh, I wish they had gone into more depth on this, that, or the other thing. Yeah.
Scholars do that.
Yeah, they do that. Yeah,
it's our job.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you. Actually, in this book, as Victor just mentioned, you compare North and South Korea. But I'd like you, maybe also, again, for the benefit of our audience, to talk a little bit about South Korea in comparison with other post-war nations in East and Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan. So, just as a way of, again, telling kind of this unique story of the development of South Korea. So what does stand out to you about South Korea's development in kind of that context? What have been South Korea's notable political and economic successes in this regional context, and to what do you attribute that success?
I think how incredibly poor South Korea was, and how many foreign economies didn't give it a chance. So we mentioned in 1960-61, when the World Bank sent a delegation to South Korea, essentially said, well, North Korea is going to be richer, because it has the resources that South Korea doesn't have. And South Korea, yes, may be able to manufacture maybe shoes, textiles, but that's it. That's it. And we do include this quote in the book. And how it transformed itself. And we explain both the internal forces driving this change and the external forces, because from my perspective, sometimes we forget the role of the Korean workers, right? Sometimes we focus on the government and the big corporations, and rightly so, and the support that comes from outside of the country, of course, including from the US, like economic aid, but not so much on the people of the country. And that's something we discussed, because for me that was fundamental to understand the change that South Korea underwent during this period of time. And interestingly for me, the first time that I went to live in Korea, in Seoul, it was because of the similarities with the history of Spain. And Spain was poor after our own civil war, but it was never as poor as South Korea was. Where you had real hunger and millions of people either dead or injured during the Korean war. So there was really little hope, right? And for other countries, you could see that they had the resources to be able to become more developed. In the case of South Korea, was really not necessarily seen at the time. And then the role of the people as well when the country became a democracy as well, because not all countries become democratic through the will of the people. I guess I compare with Spain. Spain wasn't really a bottom-up process. It was really a top-down approach to democratization. So those are things that are not necessarily unique to Korea, but certainly are different from other countries that had a different experience.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is what makes the Korean. So I think each of these countries you mentioned and economies you mentioned have their own unique story for sure. International political economy theorists and development theorists have sort of, painted some big theories to try to explain them as groups, but they all are very different. And I think what was particularly different in the Korean case, if we compare it to like Vietnam or Taiwan, were two things. One is that Korea's development came right in the epicenter of the Cold War in Asia, right? I mean, the first hot war of the Cold War, and then the Cold War in Asia afterwards. And for that reason, economic development was never just about economic development. It was always about national security, not just for Korea, but also for the United States. And so in many ways, I agree entirely with Ramon. It wasn't just the Chaebol, it wasn't just the Economic Planning Board, it was also the people. But at the same time, if we look back on this, the United States, and for that matter, Japan, could not see Korea fail. They could not see it fail because the security stakes were just so high. And so that also led to things that helped Korea's growth, but at the same time, the legacies of which we're still dealing with today. So we are now in the 60th anniversary. This is the 60th year of Japan-Korea normalization. At CSIS in June, we're going to have a big conference on this, 60th anniversary of normalization, and anybody who is even remotely familiar with this relationship knows that the legacy of history is still there. In no small part because their reconciliation was rushed, right? The United States wanted to see Japan and Korea reconcile as quickly as possible in 1965. So that clearly had economic benefits for Korea in terms of technology transfer, capital finance, grants, and all these things leading to the shipbuilding industry, the car industry. But there were also costs that came with that. But that was something that I think was kind of unique about Korea's development. Again, Vietnam has its own story, Taiwan has its own story, but I think that's what is unique about Korea.
So if you don't mind engaging in a little speculation, I'd like to ask you about the many times that the peninsula was actually on the brink of war in the last 70 years. How difficult was it for South Korea to refrain from responding to provocations over the years? can you reflect a little bit on, more recently, on this strategy of strategic patience that South Korea is engaged in?
So yes, I mean, I think there are many times the peninsula could have gone to war. When I think most of the cases I think are ones where there was some military action by North Korea, and you had governments in South Korea that were ready to respond and retaliate, and basically saying to the United States, like, we'll meet you in Pyongyang, right? You know, a role that the United States has played has always been to sort of restrain Korea from taking those actions, whether it was the Blue House raid in 1968 or the shoot down of the Korean airliner 858. I mean, there are many cases, the bombing at Kimpo Airport before the Olympics, there are many cases where either North Korean overt military action or terrorism really prompted Korea to want to act. Their development of nuclear weapons now has led to a very vigorous and robust South Korean counter strategy that is about, what is it? It's massive punishment and decapitation. In that sense, you know, there always is this threat of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But for the most part, I mean, South Korea has tried to remain restrained, in large part because they have so much more at stake, right? In terms of the people, the economy, a younger generation that doesn't really even think about North Korea or the division of Korea because it's not something they grew up with. It's something they read about in history books. So I think in that sense, you're right. There have been many times that the peninsula could have ended up in conflict, but did not.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with what you said. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to ask a question more related to kind of the current movement. And as we all know, a lot of young people around the world are drawn to South Korea, mainly out of an interest in Korean popular culture, where South Korea most definitely punches above its weight. And it also, South Korea enjoys one of the highest rates of life expectancy, 5 years higher than the US and 10 years higher than North Korea. And it also enjoys a relatively robust public health and social safety net. So what, and something also that you mentioned earlier, Ramon, about how, you know, there's so much to learn, especially, you know, when you arrive in South Korea, you suddenly start to think maybe South Korea is the first world and the US might be kind of approaching a different status. But what are some of the elements today that South Korea is a model for us to follow, even for those who consider themselves developed nations? So what are some of the elements that you think South Korea offers us as a positive model? And on the flip side, was something you also touch upon in your book, what are some of South Korea's biggest challenges that it faces socially, politically, economically today?
I think if you look at the way South Korea develops technologies, I think it is a model. And together with a colleague back at King's, we have written about this. She's more of a specialist, Robin Klinger-Vida, my colleague. She's more of a specialist on development of high tech sectors, right, across East Asia, Southeast and Northeast. And what we notice is that many Southeast Asian countries look at Korea, but increasingly we're doing our research. I remember this very vividly. We were in Central Seoul, visiting one of these garment centers where entrepreneurs are working together with the chaebol, right? They cooperate a lot. And there was quietly a visiting delegation from the Tokyo government to see how Korea is doing development, right? Without telling anyone, not because they didn't want to show that they were actually looking at Korea for their own development model, development in technologies, as a setting which they bring together this approach in which you have the universities, the chaebol, the government, the startups. I remember going to Daecheon, to the Ministry of Startups and SMEs, and you saw all of them cooperating with each other because they realized they need it. And we have noticed more and more European countries trying to follow this model. For example, last year they invited me to Slovakia because the Slovakian government is looking at Korea for its own model to nurture high-tech sectors. Even countries that you don't think maybe looking at Korea, they're actually doing so. So I think that's something that works very well. Also, what we mentioned in the book actually is that if you look at the success of the Korean culture, this came to a large extent because people were free to create the culture that they wanted, and I think that's quite important. I remember a meeting we had back in London with a visiting delegation from China actually that was looking at how to develop a successful cultural sector, and they were asking me about Korea, and I said, well, you have to change your political regime, sorry, right? Because otherwise, people in other parts of the world are not going to be attracted to a particular culture that is more state control or censored by the state. And you really see that. So if you go to, I'm sure it's the same here in the US, but you go to different European cities, go to the town center, and you have these young kids doing their K-pop routines, right? And they like the way it has been perfection, but also the way that this can be created by the artists in the way they see fit. And I think that's something that you may not realize here in the US, because you've been a democracy for a very long period of time, right? But for countries where this wasn't the case in the past, and we used to have a dictatorial regime, the fact that you can act in the way you want, I think is a model for other countries in which this might not be possible.
Yeah, so when I travel through Incheon Airport in Korea, or when I go across bridges in Korea, I feel like Korea's first world, and maybe more than we are here. So I think this point about how, if you think about the way the younger generation and the world think about Korea today, it's so different, right? So when I was growing up, people, when they knew Korea, when Americans knew Korea, all they knew was the Korean War and the television show MASH, right? Those were the two things they know. And there's actually polling, right? There's actually polling that shows that was the case. And if you look at the situation today, there was a study done, I think it was by the Modern Language Association, right? That looked at the past 10 years of foreign language enrollment in US universities. And it was basically flat for every language, including Romance languages, Chinese and Japanese. It was basically flat for every language except one language, and that was Korean. You know this better than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
With the work that you do, and the curve, the graph looked like this. It was just shooting up at a ridiculous rate. At my university, all of our elementary Korean and intermediate Korean classes are completely full. That used to be the case for China, 10 years ago, but now it's Korean. It's completely full. And when we were doing these, talking about the book in Europe, we did a tour in Europe last spring. We were in London and Paris and Berlin and Madrid. Everybody in the room who had come to the book talk were not coming for Korean politics, Korean democracy, Korean business, North Korean nuclear weapons. They were all there because they liked K-dramas, Korean food, or K-pop. And they were like, oh, I want to read about Korea now. Here's a book I can read about Korea. So, personally, Ramon is used to this because he lives in Europe and, he works between Brussels and London. But for me, it was really eye-opening. This was my 7th book. I had never been in audiences like that. Usually it was very specialist type audiences, people who were interested in Korea for one reason or another, but not this sort of broader interest in Korea. So I think that's something that's unusual. But as your question suggests, these things don't come without a price. All of the studies show that Korea is a very successful, South Korea is a very successful society, but it shows all the telltale signs of a very stressed modern society, right? In terms of, income inequality, cost of living, suicide rates. It's a very stressed society, and perhaps that is part of the price you pay when you grow so fast. Like Korea grew, what it took countries in Europe and other places, 2 generations to accomplish, Korea was doing in 1 generation or half a generation. And so, I think those are some of the stresses that come with that.
Can you follow up a little bit, discuss especially the crisis around demographics these days, the shrinking birth rate, if you can say a few words about that.
Yes, we talk about it in the book. I mean, and we make this case, as Victor said, because we present the book in different places. So, for example, we had this question in Germany, for example, right? And it was very interesting that the audience in Germany could really relate because they're undergoing the same process. So we realized that this is a universal story. I remember after the discussion, because we had a more or less heated exchange with someone in the audience, and some younger girls came to talk to us, and they said, "Yeah, it's good you say so, right?" So we mentioned in the book that partly has to do with the success of the country and the fact that the women have a choice, right? And as I said, that has come out in our discussions we have had saying, yes, why are we expected to have kids, not in Korea, but in other countries, in this case in Europe, right? So I think that the positives that lead to this situation, right, well, men also, they have a choice, right, whether they want to have children or not, and many of them have decided that's not the case. You may attribute this to the economic situation that some of them may have, in some other cases because they simply think that their lifestyle is good enough as it is, and they don't want this to change. But that's something that, from my perspective, is not going to change dramatically, not only in Korea, but in any other developed country. Frankly speaking, I mean, I think you all know that over the past year or so, the birth rate is actually going up in Korea, and probably will continue to go up for the next few years with the marriage rate going up, but it's not going to go to the magical 2.1 kids per women that we need to keep the population growth sustainable, right? But not only in Korea, as I said. I mean, when I talk to my students back in London, like here, obviously, university is very international. For many younger people, it's really a lifestyle choice, right? Even before they start thinking about their own economic situation or social situation. The only thing that I would say that is different about Korea, and actually Taiwan and Japan and China as well, is that in these countries, compared to the US or compared to Europe, Australia, Canada, most kids, 95% of them, are born in married couples, right? And if you look at countries in Europe, in Spain, for example, we're supposed to be a very Catholic country, but more than half of kids are actually born out of wedlock, right? Which actually helps you have the marriage rate a bit higher than it is in other places, because you don't need this first step, which is getting married. So maybe in Korea this may change. We don't know, and then some people will say, well, it's not necessarily bad to have kids outside of the wedlock, and this will help with the marriage rate to go even a bit higher up to the levels that we have in Southern Europe, which is 1.3 more or less, right? But I don't see a big change taking place, to be honest.
If I can just follow up also with Victor, I mean, has the demographic crisis been framed as a national security crisis?
I think in some sense it has. I mean, if you look at what Korea's plans are for their military, not just military modernization, but the military force of the future, it's very clear that the demographics don't add up. There's no way they could field the sort of force that they want to 20 years from now, given the demographic trends. I will say that when Ramon was right, we were in Germany when this conversation came up. Before the event, we were like, okay, we're in Germany. We're going to get a lot of questions about unification, right? And it ended up being all about, right, demographics.
Demographics,
Yeah.
yes.
So
Big topic in Germany.
Don't know what to expect.
Big topic in Germany.
Yeah, big topic in Germany. So.
Right. So before I turn to audience questions, I did want to provide a quote. One of the quotes that really stayed with me as I was reading this book. This is from page 188. They write, "In an ideal world, Korean unification would boast the marriage of South Korean cutting-edge technology and capital with North Korean cheap labor and abundant mineral resources. The enfranchised democracy of a united Korea would have a total population of 80 to 90 million, putting it on par with Japan. The peninsula would become a throughway of commerce and energy, connecting all of maritime Asia with continental East Asia and the Eurasian landmass. Unification would mean the end of a major security threat in the heart of East Asia and could produce peace dividends for all. That's a really beautiful vision. But then you add, why is it so hard to achieve this vision? So I wonder if you could share your thoughts on why it's so hard. Seems like a great vision, though.
Yeah. Well, why? Well, why? Yes. Well,
It's a tough question, so
It's
you
a-
go ahead.
Gosh, there's so many reasons. I'll start with one that I think that people often don't think about, or at least people who don't really follow Korea closely, and that is that it's not really something that's desirable of the sort of current and future generations in Korea. There really is a gap between how people 50 years and older think about unification in Korea versus people who are younger than 50 years old. For the younger people, the division of Korea is something they read about in history books. Sometimes they hear stories from their grandparents about separated families and relatives in the north, or probably more likely land that they hold in the north. I mean, this is another one that we often hear. But for the younger generation, they only know one Korea, they only know one world, and they don't think about this vision that we've talked about. We talk about this in the book. We've done some other research where we've actually talked to North Koreans about how they think about unification. And surprisingly, they actually have a much more romanticized view of unification than people in the South. People in the South are very pragmatic about it, economic costs involved, these sorts of things. But from a North Korean perspective, for the ones we were able to talk to, they thought about it in terms of ethnic identity, right? Single Korean population. They thought about it in terms of economics, and they thought about it in terms of this, almost this notion of the end of history, the end of a piece of Korean history, the division of Korea, against the backdrop of thousands of years of a single country. So that I think is quite interesting. That's not the only reason, but I think it is certainly one of the reasons. The other is that you have two states that have since the late 1940s been very well ensconced in their two systems and supported by big powers around them, and it's hard to break that geopolitical geopolitical blocks. It's very hard to break that, even though there might be a common vision or a common outcome in the future that could be mutually beneficial. The path to getting to that point is fraught with all sorts of dangers, concerns, by not just South and North Korea, but by the United States, by China, by Japan, by Russia, that makes it very difficult for two Korean leaders really to push towards that end point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we also do make the point in the book that when young South Koreans are asked about reunification in the abstract, they may be opposed to it, but then when you present it in different types of scenarios, right, from more pragmatic perspective, and if the time comes, we think that South Koreans would rally behind it, regardless of the generation they may belong to. But now to them it looks so abstract that they don't think it's something that benefits their own country.
Maybe we can jump to the current moment that we are living in. Since the South Korean president's failed declaration of martial law on December 3rd, the streets of Seoul, as I can attest to, as I just returned yesterday, are filled with protesters, both in support of and against the current president. Can you recap for the audience what led to the current moment, to the declaration of martial law, and what political polarization may mean for the peninsula going forward?
You want to start?
Yeah, another tough one, so I take it. Yes, I think the polarization that you mentioned was the root cause. I think, President Yoon has said that he felt that this was the only way to break the political deadlock. Not that I'm agreeing or disagreeing with this view, but that's the argument that he has made. I mean, he not only had issues with the opposition party, even within his own party, he didn't have a good relationship with many members of his own party, right? So that made it very difficult for him to really pass any sort of domestic legislation. And I think, I mean, he had been accused of not consulting widely when taking decisions. And it seems that this declaration, very few people in his government actually knew that this was coming, which went out to this idea that he wasn't really consulting widely, because I don't know how you can think that in contemporary Korea this would hold any sway. I mean, it was 6 hours long, right? So that suggests that he didn't really ask, even within his cabinet, where others would have told him, look, this is going nowhere. And I think that seems to be another reason that the isolation in which he was taking many of these decisions. And then where we're headed, we'll see, I think, in mid-March, we should know what the Constitutional Court says about the impeachment, whether it was legal or not, and then we would probably have elections in April or May, so we'll have a new president. What I find interesting is that there's an internal polarization, but internationally I thought that South Korea was going to take a bigger hit than it has, and it actually hasn't. It's very interesting how it's still been invited to all these summits, all these meetings, not at the leaders level, of course, but you still see all these business people going to Korea. So that's what I found very interesting. Not only the resilience of the system, that the declaration really only lasted 6 hours, and really within 3-4 hours we knew it was going to fail, right? So it only lasted 6 hours, but also that internationally, for many countries, okay, there will be a new president, we're going to continue to be working with Korea. And the polarization itself, I mean, my impression from outside of the US is that these countries really polarize, even more so than Korea, right? And that Korea has a similar level of polarization as many European countries, where the system still works. I'm not saying I'm not going to criticize the US. Victor, you can do so, please. But, you know, the system still works. And within this system, there's a very, very, very strong debate, including, as you say, demonstrations in the street, which for us, I mean, you probably don't know this, but South Korea, France, and Spain are the 3 democratic countries with the largest number of demonstrations on an annual basis, right? So for me, it's extremely normal. I go to Korea, oh, this is like back in Madrid, you know? People are demonstrating in the street every weekend. It's like national sport. So for me, it's something normal. So I don't see that as part of polarization. I see it as part of the political game, right? That you express yourself in this way. And I completely get it that in some other countries that's not necessarily true, that you have so many demonstrations, which, as I say, something you kind of do, not as a hobby, but something that you do on a very regular basis.
Yeah, Victor, can you say something about where North, you know, sort of what this means for national security as well, or yeah?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, Korea right now is at a point where they have an acting government that really cannot do much, in part because of the political polarization in the country, this unresolved impeachment crisis. It's very hard for an acting government to actually govern, because if they take actions that are too drastic or that are too forward-leaning, it gets brawled up in politics. So it really is almost the absence of government. And the North Koreans have not, they really haven't done much. So in that sense, I think obviously the military still functions in Korea. The United States commitment is still there. Maybe they are still deterred by this. But I want to say on the actual crisis itself, I think initially some of us, when we were asked about it, after Yoon declared martial law and then it was overturned, we talked about it as being a victory for democracy, that democracy still holds in Korea. And I don't know about Ramon, but I got a lot of criticism for that, because they were saying that, oh, you're talking about this as though it's a success or a victory, but you're not focusing on the failure of the leadership in Korea. And I understand that point, but at the same time, I think that not just the institutional process of how the legislature overturned the impeachment decree, But just the notion in Korea and around the world, given Korea's history, about how absurd an act it was, just completely absurd, that to the point where people are like, this is fake news. This cannot be real. This didn't, like, no duly elected leader of Korea would actually do something this absurd. And so in that sense, I think it really did reinforce democracy, because that is just completely inappropriate behavior, and nobody would sort of accept that behavior, I think. And I think that's an important lesson to learn. But as Ramon said, we're still not out of this. The Constitutional Court has to rule on the constitutionality of what President Yoon did. And after their verdict, if they rule that it was unconstitutional, there's a 60-day campaign period and a newly elected president of Korea probably sometime in the early summer. I would just say that while we are going through this in Korea, at the same time, we have a new government here in the United States that is rolling out new things, like not even every day, every hour. And we saw the Japanese Prime Minister come and have a summit meeting, but Korea will be very far behind by the time that they have their election in the summer on any host of issues, including tariffs, trade relations, things with North Korea. So it's not a good position to be in.
All right. So you've answered two questions actually from the audience. One regarding the changes that we can expect vis-a-vis the new administration in Washington, and the other about sort of this perceived internal weakness or turmoil, political turmoil in Korea, and what it means for the current the geopolitical position and regionally. I don't know if you have any follow-up kind of comments on what we can expect to happen just more generally in East Asia.
I mean, the one thing Ramon said is that the world, he thought Korea's standing in the world would go down, but on the contrary, people are watching very closely what is going on, and they're not necessarily criticizing Korea. I think that's because the international community wants and needs Korea to be back. They need them to be back. I mean, we all know what kind of stress the global rules-based international order is under right now. Korea is a very important member of that order. It's one of the key and top suppliers in terms of supply chains with regard to chips. 12th, 13th largest economy, big public goods provider in the international scene. There are a lot of things that Korea does to help support the rules-based international order, and to sort of see it off the stage right now is just something that people don't want to see, given everything else that's going on in the world. So I think that there is the desire to see Korea come back among the international community as soon as possible.
Yeah. Now, with that, from us, very telling. Last week, you had this very big business delegation coming here to the U.S. in the absence of a president who can come over and have a summit with President Trump. You have this business delegation, which is sometimes treated almost as royalty. It's very interesting, right? Because of the huge amount of investment they can bring. You have SK, Samsung, LG, the different companies, and the way they are being treated. And it's not only here in the US. When they come to Europe, is the same. So over the past, since the pandemic, really, when travel reopened, you would have these delegations coming from Korea, and vice versa. You would have European delegations going to Korea. I remember this very distinctly, actually. 2 years ago, the Spanish Prime Minister went one day after the Dutch premier, and the first thing both of them did, they went to Pyeongtaek, to the Samsung semiconductor factory, even before they met the president, right? That's what they want. So it's very interesting how this turmoil that we have seen in South Korea, because of the other strengths that the country has, in this case the economic strength, is actually helping the country in a way that if it was weaker, I think many would have thought, well, look, it's a basket case, it's not going to recover, it's the old Korea, but that's not the perception really of the country.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we were both at a conference in DC before coming out here last week, and I think even like for European countries, as Ramon said, Korea is very important. I mean, we have to remember, up until all this happened, Korea was participating in the NATO Leaders Summit in Madrid, in Vilnius. They're participating in the G7 summits, right? So they were a very important player on the international stage. They were, key supporter of Ukraine, humanitarian assistance, and also some military support. So So the international community, they want to see Korea come back, and they want all this to be resolved as quickly as possible.
So there's a question here actually about rebuilding and unification. And so based on your reflections on South Korea and its transition from conflict, are there any overlaps or commonalities that can be applied to other countries such as Ukraine, which will be looking to rebuild and unify after the war? So again, questions about what kind of model South Korea can offer.
Yeah, that has been discussed really since the beginning of Russia's invasion. When it was clear that Russia was going to fail in taking over the whole of Ukraine, but also it was becoming clear that they would be able to hold part of the territorial gains. And in Europe, there has been from the beginning the discussion about the Korean model, both the positives and the negatives, right? The negative, the entrenchment of the division of the country, but then the positives, a country such as South Korea that was devastated by the war, and then thanks to its own internal dynamics, but also outside help, he was able to reach the level of development where it is today. And actually, last Monday, we had a very good conference back in Cambridge in the UK, with some Ukrainian MPs and British MPs and leaders from other European countries, and this was very much discussed, right? The need that Ukraine has of receiving South Korean support, material support, investment, absolutely, technologies, but also as a model of how you can transform your country even when you're facing a direct threat, because the threat for Ukraine is not going to disappear. Russia is going to continue to be there in the way that South Korea is bordering North Korea and obviously is right next to China, so the threat never disappeared for South Korea during the Cold War. It was able to develop. So that's been very much discussed, and you will see advisors from South Korea going to Ukraine and vice versa. Ukrainian delegations already being prepared to go to South Korea to learn how South Korea recovered from the war. So it's going to be a very big topic, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, there's clearly parallel there, both in terms of the difficult things like the invasion, armistice, right, ceasefire to the hostilities, but also, I mean, regardless of how this all turns out, there will be a lot of interest in Europe and in Asia to see Ukraine built up as a bulwark against further Russian aggression in Europe, just like Korea was built up as a bulwark against communist aggression in Asia. So I think there are lots of parallels there. The First Lady of Ukraine has been to Korea. Zelensky has spoken to the Korean parliament. We both know the Ukrainian ambassador in Korea. He's a very busy person. Lots of activity taking place, and I think Korea will be a very big participant in that effort.
So there's a question here related, it brings us back a little bit to the earlier conversation about the costs of growth. Countries look to South Korea as a model for society and technology, as you've both mentioned. What are the challenges of adopting that development and growth? Maybe as we think also about Ukraine, what is distinct? Is there anything distinct about Korean culture that makes it particularly effective in Korea? And again, what challenges? And also, there's a question about income inequality, as you mentioned. And so, if you can speak a little bit to challenges of growth and development.
So that's a very interesting question as well, right? Because if you look at income inequality, it's not that high by developed country standards, but wealth inequality in Korea is quite high and growing, right? And that's an interesting dynamic. And yes, of course, it's not only about Korea suffering this type of inequalities, but you see how difficult it is to tackle, especially wealth accumulation, right? And then redistribute this is very difficult to achieve. And it seems that when you look at countries in Central and Eastern Europe, what they're trying to achieve is the rate of economic growth, but without this level of income and wealth inequality, right? Countries such as Czech Republic, Poland, etc., because they realize that later on, once they have become fully developed, it might be more difficult to tackle because the economy will be more open, right? And the type of jobs being created, there will be this difference in the type of jobs being created, really high-paying jobs, in many cases with multinationals, right? And then other people who won't be able to access these jobs. But they're struggling to achieve this. But this is what they learned not only from Korea, but from other countries in which, as they grew richer, they reached a point in which inequality, yes, started to increase. But we see how difficult it is because they're not being able to achieve so. So I don't know if there is a lesson there that maybe the lesson is that if you end up growing and achieving this level of economic success, you have to accept that there's going to be a degree of inequality that can lead to some issues, such as political polarization in many countries is also about inequality, right? And if you look at populism, right, in Germany we had elections yesterday, and for the first time since the Second World War, a really right-wing populist party has become the second most voted party in Germany, 20% share of the vote. And a lot of this has to do with the income inequality that you have in Germany between Eastern Germany, that continues to be far poorer than Western Germany, not poor by global standards, but by German standards. So it seems that it's very difficult to tackle that, and then you have to prepare for the political polarization that may come with it. And it goes back to a point that Victor made. Then you need a really resilient system to ensure that democratic system continues to function, which in my way, in my view, I agree with Victor. I think Korea has the system. And we saw how Jun failed in his attempt to impose a martial law because the system worked well. So maybe there is a lesson there for other countries. Make sure you have robust institutions, because otherwise the political polarization that comes from inequality can lead to the failure of the system.
Yeah, I think one of the big lessons that come out of the book when we think about Korea across the broad, expansive history, and we think about other cases like Ukraine, is that is this point about resilience. You know, at time and time again throughout history, Korea has been sort of at the precipice, right? At the precipice, even like survival, national survival at the precipice, and they've always managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. They've always been able to do that in one way or another, and that speaks to the resilience of the country and the people. Korean history has never been gradual. It's always been punctuated equilibria, right? The collapse of a dynasty, right? The occupation by a foreign power, the end of that occupation, liberation, war, democracy. It's always been sort of these crisis moments, but they've always managed to pull through. And I think in the future, the next one for Korea inevitably will be unification, probably through the collapse of the North. And again, this will be another moment in history where people will say, oh my gosh, are they going to be able to survive? And it'll be difficult, but they will. And I think that's the main lesson. And why I think there are elements of that that are uniquely Korean, I don't think it's just about being Korean. I think, you know, societies, particularly free societies, when they're in these sorts of situations, they find a way to be resilient, right? And I think that speaks to Ukraine's future. I think it also speaks to Taiwan's future. You know, people are always like, oh, can the Taiwanese be as resilient as the Ukrainians? If they face the same sort of challenge, an invasion by somebody else, I think they can, right? And so I think that's one of the biggest lessons of Korea for these other cases.
Well, this would be a perfect place to end, but I do want to ask one last question because we have a couple from the audience, and I want us to end with culture. So I'm going to combine these two questions. So there's a question about the role that you think Korean popular culture, the positive role that it may continue to play in kind of regional and global dynamics. So something about maybe cultural diplomacy or just the role of culture on the one hand, and on the other, the rise of and the growth and popularity also of films and literature that are actually quite critical internally, and if that is, if you see that maybe also contributing to some kind of shift in perception of Korea.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll tackle the second first, because it goes back to the point that we made before, how important it is to be free, for artists to be free, right? Because you cannot tackle these topics in a dictatorial regime. They would allow you to criticize inequality in your own country, right? Or other topics that are dealt with in Korean movies and dramas, or even some of the songs by BTS that focus on mental health issues among the young population, right? Those type of things. So yes, I think that sometimes it has shifted perceptions for the negative, saying, oh, look, all these problems that Korea has, but also for the positive. Look, they're able to tell these stories that actually happen in our societies as well. in a way that means that others want to follow them. So last year I was invited to the Rome. They had this diplomacy month of diplomacy, I think they call it, right? And talking to some students who were attending, they were asking precisely this question. But they were also commenting this. They said, "Oh, it's the same issues we face in Italy, right? Some mental health issues or inequality, all these type of things, but tell it in an entertaining way. So it makes you want to follow the story, to see the story, right? And in a sense that, interestingly, it seems that for young people, they see this as a positive, that you're able to tackle these different topics and difficult topics in a way that others want to see how you deal with them, right, and how you tackle them. And on the first question, it's simply incredible. When we had these events in many different places, you have people in their 60s who would have known nothing about Korea, no connection whatsoever to Korea, and then they come to talk to you. And after the book, then I say, "Oh, I was watching these dramas, sometimes during the pandemic, for example, all these movies, and I just became interested in a country I knew nothing about, or maybe the Korean War." Yes, because they have discussed the Korean War, and the positive perception that they have of the country because they enjoy their culture, and without knowing the language or not knowing more about the country. And interestingly, this leads to the greater interest they have on the country, the visits to the country. So my parents who are in their 70s now, the friends of theirs going to Korea in their 70s, right? And they had never been outside of Europe, never mind going to Asia, right? Never been outside of Europe. And they go in these tours to Korea because they want to know more about the country, because they're fascinated about the movies or in the literature recently as well. And we have these concerts, right, by K-pop bands. They come to Europe, it's completely full. So it was announced last week. Blackpink is going to go to Wembley Stadium. Like they're going to have 60,000 people watching their concert, and they're going to sell out. I know because I want to get a ticket, actually. So on the 27th, I think there's 24th and 27th, I'm going to be clicking there. I might miss the book talk then. No, but they're going to have a second concert, we already know, right? Because of how successful they are, but the positive perception that people have of Korea because of these bands, of these movies, even when they're tackling all these topics that are negative, they portray Korea in a negative way. But the people just want to follow them, and they're all ages. I find that they're really, really interesting, actually.
Thank you. All right.
I think he's really summed it up well.
I was accused of, because we have a picture of Blackpink in the book as opposed to BTS, and I was accused of being a Blink, so now I have to go to the concert,
All right. Well, this is a perfect place to end. That's actually all the time we have for today. So Victor and Ramon, thank you so much for your time and your many insights. And thank you also to our audience for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. Victor and Ramon will be signing copies of their book in the lounge outside the auditorium shortly. Finally, Commonwealth Club World Affairs warmly encourages you to come back for future programs, become a member, and support the mission of nurturing vital civic education, engagement, and dialogue. To find out more, please visit the website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.